I was 3 days into my deployment in South Korea when I received an email that made my blood pressure spike higher than any military drill ever could. The subject line read, "Immediate action required. Property violation notice 3 final warning." I stared at my phone screen in the dimly lit barracks, my jaw clenching as I opened the message from Deborah Winters, president of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association in suburban Atlanta, Georgia. The email was lengthy, filled with capitalized words and exclamation points that screamed entitlement through the digital void. According to Deborah, my lawn had grown to an unacceptable height of 4 inches, my mailbox needed repainting, and there were visible weeds in my flower beds. She demanded immediate compliance within 72 hours or face daily fines of $100. The kicker: she knew I was deployed. My wife had already informed the HOA board 2 months ago, before I left, that I would be serving overseas for 6 months with the United States Army. My name is Aaron Anderson, and I had purchased my home in Meadowbrook Hills 3 years prior, excited to finally have a piece of the American dream after years of military service. The neighborhood was beautiful, with tree-lined streets and well-maintained properties. The HOA seemed reasonable at first, just basic rules about keeping things tidy. But 6 months ago, Deborah Winters had been elected president, and everything changed overnight. I called my younger brother Marcus immediately, despite the 13-hour time difference. He answered groggily on the 4th ring. "Aaron, man, it's like 2 in the morning here. Everything okay?" "No, it's not okay. I need you to check on the house. The HOA is threatening me with fines while I'm literally serving my country overseas." Marcus was quiet for a moment, and I could hear him shuffling around, probably sitting up in bed. "Wait, what? How can they do that? Isn't there a law or something?" "That's what I need to find out. Can you drive by tomorrow and take some pictures? I need to see how bad things actually look." "Yeah, of course. I'll go first thing in the morning. Send me the email." I forwarded Deborah's message and tried to get some sleep, but my mind raced with anger and frustration. I had served my country for 12 years, done 3 tours overseas, and this was the thanks I got. Some power-hungry HOA president threatening my finances while I was thousands of miles away. The next morning, Marcus sent me a series of photos. My lawn looked fine, maybe slightly longer than the pristine golf course appearance some neighbors maintained, but nothing egregious. It was barely 4 inches, right at the maximum allowed height according to the HOA bylaws. The mailbox had one small spot where the paint had chipped, probably from a recent hailstorm we'd had before I left. The weeds in the flower beds were minimal, just a few dandelions that had sprouted recently. I immediately began researching military protections, and that's when I discovered the Service Members Civil Relief Act, or SCRA. This federal law provided numerous protections for active duty military members, including protections against certain civil actions during deployment. I also found information about the Military Spouses Residency Relief Act and various state-level protections Georgia offered. But I wanted to handle this properly, so I reached out to the Judge Advocate General's office on base. Captain Lisa Chen, a military attorney, reviewed my situation during her office hours that afternoon. "Mr. Anderson, you have a strong case here," she said, scrolling through the documents I'd provided. "The Service Members Civil Relief Act provides specific protections. While HOAs aren't explicitly mentioned, the law prevents civil actions that would materially affect your rights during active service. Additionally, Georgia has specific statutes protecting deployed service members from HOA actions. So they can't fine me. They can attempt to, but those fines would likely be unenforceable. Georgia Code Section 44-3-224 specifically addresses this. You need to notify them in writing of your military status and your deployment. Do you have someone who can maintain the property? My brother can help, but he works full-time and lives an hour away. He can't be there every week. That should be sufficient for basic maintenance. The law doesn't require perfection, just reasonable upkeep. I'll help you draft a formal response. With Captain Chen's assistance, I composed a detailed letter to Deborah Winters and the Meadowbrook Hills HOA board. I cited the relevant federal and state laws, included copies of my deployment orders with sensitive information redacted, and explained that my brother would handle basic maintenance as his schedule allowed. I also requested they cease all fine assessments immediately and withdraw the violation notices. I sent the letter via email and certified mail, feeling confident that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 3 days later, I received another email from Deborah. This one was even more aggressive than the first. She claimed that the SCRA didn't apply to HOA matters because they were contractual obligations I'd agreed to when purchasing the home. She insisted that the 72-hour deadline had passed and that I now owed $300 in fines. Furthermore, she stated that if the violations weren't corrected within another 72 hours, the fines would increase to $200 per day, and the HOA would hire contractors to fix the issues at my expense, plus a 30% administrative fee. I was furious. I immediately forwarded the email to Captain Chen, who was equally appalled. This woman either doesn't understand the law or doesn't care, Captain Chen said during our video call. We need to escalate this. I'm going to connect you with a civilian attorney who specializes in HOA disputes and military protections. His name is James Rodriguez, and he's based in Atlanta. He does pro bono work for deployed service members. James Rodriguez was a godsend. A former Marine himself, he understood both the military world and the often Byzantine world of HOA regulations. We had our first call the following day. Aaron, I've dealt with cases like this before, and I'm going to be straight with you. Some HOA board members get drunk on their tiny bit of power and think they're above the law. Deborah Winters has a reputation in the Atlanta area. She's been involved in 3 other HOAs before Meadowbrook Hills, and she left each one amid controversy. Can we sue her? We can, and we might need to. But first, let me send her a formal legal letter. Sometimes that's enough to make them back down. If not, we'll file an injunction and potentially a lawsuit for harassment and violation of federal and state law. James sent a comprehensive legal letter to Deborah and the HOA board the next day. It was 8 pages long, meticulously citing case law, federal statutes, state regulations, and previous judgments against HOAs that had violated service members' rights. He made it clear that any fines assessed would be challenged in court, and that the HOA could face significant penalties for violating federal law, including paying my attorney's fees and potentially punitive damages. I thought surely that would end things. Again, I was wrong. Instead of backing down, Deborah doubled down. She sent an email not just to me but to several of my neighbors, claiming I was trying to get special treatment, and that allowing my property to fall into disrepair would hurt everyone's property values. She conveniently left out the part about me being deployed overseas in service of my country. That's when my neighbors started reaching out. I'd been friendly with several of them before deployment, and they were appalled by Deborah's behavior. Tom Harrison, who lived 3 houses down and was a Vietnam veteran himself, called me via WhatsApp. Aaron, I just got the most ridiculous email from Deborah. She's trying to turn the neighborhood against you. I walked by your place yesterday and it looks fine. Maybe not magazine perfect, but perfectly acceptable. This is garbage. I appreciate that, Tom. My attorney is handling it, but she seems determined to push this. Well, she's messing with the wrong guy. My son is an investigative reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Mind if I mention this to him? I hesitated. I didn't want to become a news story, but maybe public pressure was exactly what Deborah needed. Let me think about it. I don't want to make things worse. Son, it can't get much worse. This woman is harassing a deployed soldier. That's not going to play well in the court of public opinion. Before I could make a decision about involving the media, Deborah made another move that forced my hand. She sent a formal notice stating that the HOA had hired a landscaping company to bring my property into compliance, and that I would be billed $850 for the service, plus a $255 administrative fee. The work was scheduled for the following Monday. I immediately called James Rodriguez. She can't do that, right? I asked, though my stomach was already churning with anxiety. She absolutely cannot do that, not while you're deployed and covered under the SCRA. I'm filing for an emergency injunction today. We're also filing a lawsuit against the HOA and Deborah Winters personally for harassment, violation of the Service Members Civil Relief Act, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Personally, can we do that? When an HOA board member acts with gross negligence or malice, going beyond their official duties, they can lose their personal liability protection. Based on her emails and the fact that you've repeatedly informed her of your military status and legal protections, I believe we can make a strong case that she's acting with malice. James worked quickly. By Friday afternoon, he'd filed the injunction and the lawsuit. The injunction hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. James assured me he could handle it, but I wanted to be there. My commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel David Park, was understanding when I explained the situation. This is exactly the kind of thing the SCRA was designed to prevent, he said. File for emergency leave. Your family situation qualifies. Get home, handle this, and get back here. Getting emergency leave approved and flights arranged took 2 days, but by Wednesday evening, I was landing at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Marcus picked me up, and the first thing I noticed was how tired he looked. "You okay, man?" I asked as we loaded my bag into his truck. "Yeah, just stressed. Deborah has been calling me. She somehow got my number and keeps demanding I tell her when you'll be back to face the consequences of your actions. I finally blocked her. She called you. How did she even get your number? No idea. It's creepy, honestly." We drove to my house in Meadowbrook Hills, arriving around 10 at night. The streetlights cast long shadows across the quiet suburban street. My house looked fine, exactly as it had in Marcus's photos. The lawn was perhaps slightly longer than some neighbors, but well within reasonable standards. The mailbox had that one small paint chip. The flower beds had a few weeds but were far from overgrown. 3 houses down, I could see Deborah Winters' house. A massive 2-story colonial with professional landscape lighting, and a lawn that looked like it had been manicured with scissors. Her lights were on, and I could see movement through the windows. "She's probably watching us right now," Marcus muttered. "She's always watching. It's like she has nothing better to do than monitor everyone's houses." I stayed at my house that night, jet-lagged but unable to sleep. I kept thinking about the hearing the next day and what would happen. James had prepared me thoroughly via video calls, but I was still nervous. The next morning, I met James at the DeKalb County Courthouse. He was a tall, imposing man in his 50s with graying hair and a confident demeanor that immediately put me at ease. "Aaron, Good to finally meet you in person. How was the flight? Long, but I'm here. What should I expect today? The judge will hear arguments from both sides regarding the injunction. We're asking the court to prevent the HOA from assessing any fines or taking any action against your property while you're deployed. We'll also present our case for why the lawsuit should proceed. Inside the courtroom, I saw Deborah Winters for the first time in person since before my deployment. She was a woman in her late 40s with perfectly styled blonde hair, wearing a business suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She sat with the HOA's attorney, a young man who looked fresh out of law school and distinctly uncomfortable. Judge Patricia Martinez called the case to order. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd been on the bench for 20 years. I'd researched her background and knew she had a reputation for fairness but little patience for frivolous arguments. James presented our case first, methodically laying out the timeline of events, the repeated notifications of my military status, Deborah's continued harassment, and the clear violations of federal and state law. He presented all the emails as evidence, highlighting Deborah's increasingly aggressive tone and her explicit acknowledgement that she knew I was deployed. Your Honor, James concluded, Mr. Anderson is currently serving his country in South Korea. He has arranged for basic maintenance through his brother, who works full-time and lives an hour away. The property is not in disrepair. The alleged violations are minor and subjective. The HOA president has been informed multiple times of Mr. Anderson's deployment and the applicable legal protections. Yet she continues to threaten fines and has scheduled unauthorized work on his property. This is precisely the kind of harassment the Service Members Civil Relief Act was designed to prevent. The HOA's attorney, whose name was Brian Fletcher, stood to present their argument. He looked nervous, constantly glancing at Deborah, who kept leaning over to whisper instructions to him. Your Honor, the HOA maintains that Mr. Anderson entered into a contractual obligation when he purchased his home in Meadowbrook Hills. These obligations don't simply disappear because of military service. The community has standards that must be maintained to protect property values for all residents. Judge Martinez interrupted him. Counselor, are you aware of the Service Members Civil Relief Act? Yes, Your Honor, but we maintain that it doesn't apply in this context because it absolutely applies in this context, Judge Martinez said sharply. Have you read Georgia Code Section 44-3224? Brian Fletcher fumbled with his papers. Your Honor, I have reviewed the relevant statutes and we believe. What you believe is irrelevant. The law is clear. Mr. Fletcher, how long have you been practicing law? 18 months, Your Honor. I see. And has your client informed you of Mr. Anderson's repeated notifications regarding his deployment and the applicable legal protections? Deborah leaned over to whisper to Brian again, but Judge Martinez cut her off. Miss Winters, you'll have your chance to speak if I call you to testify. Please allow your attorney to answer. Brian looked miserable. Your Honor, Mrs. Winters has informed me that Mr. Anderson's property violates multiple HOA bylaws and that the association has an obligation to all residents to enforce these bylaws uniformly. Judge Martinez removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes, a gesture that conveyed her exhaustion with the argument. Uniformly means treating everyone equally, Counselor, not ignoring federal law. Mr. Rodriguez, I'm granting your injunction. The HOA is hereby prohibited from assessing any fines against Mr. Anderson's property, taking any enforcement action, or entering his property for any reason while he remains on active deployment. Furthermore, any fines already assessed are voided. Your Honor, Brian started, but Judge Martinez held up her hand. "I'm not finished. This case demonstrates such a clear violation of federal law that I'm concerned about the HOA board's judgment. I'm also ordering Miss Winters and the entire HOA board to attend a 4-hour educational seminar on HOA law and service members' rights within 30 days. The HOA will bear the cost. Additionally, given the harassment documented in these emails, I'm awarding Mr. Anderson attorney's fees for this hearing. We'll address the broader lawsuit at the next hearing, which I'm scheduling for 60 days from now. That should give Mr. Anderson time to return from deployment." Deborah's face turned red. She stood up suddenly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is ridiculous. You can't force us to attend a seminar like we're children." Judge Martinez's expression hardened. "Miss Winters, I can and I just did. I suggest you sit down and remain quiet, or I'll hold you in contempt of court. This soldier gets to ignore the rules everyone else has to follow, and we're the ones being punished. His property is bringing down our neighborhood values." Miss Winters' final warning. "Sit down." But Deborah was on a roll, her voice rising. "I will not sit down. This is America and I have rights. I have worked tirelessly to maintain our community standards, and this judge is going to side with someone who can't even be bothered to maintain his property because of some law that doesn't apply. Bailiff, please escort Miss Winters out of my courtroom." "Miss Winters, you're in contempt of court. I'm fining you $500. Two bailiffs moved toward Deborah, who finally seemed to realize she'd gone too far. Her face shifted from anger to shock. "You can't be serious." "I'm entirely serious. You can pay the fine, or you can spend 24 hours in jail. Your choice." The bailiffs escorted a sputtering Deborah out of the courtroom. Brian Fletcher looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The remaining HOA board members who'd attended, 3 middle-aged men who'd been sitting quietly in the back, looked equally mortified. Judge Martinez addressed them directly. "Gentlemen, I assume you're on the HOA board with Miss Winters." They nodded, and one of them, a balding man in khakis and a polo shirt, stood. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm Richard Caldwell, the HOA treasurer. I want to apologize for Miss Winters' behavior. Several of us on the board weren't fully informed about this situation. When we learned Mr. Anderson was deployed, we thought the matter had been dropped. Clearly it wasn't. I suggest you have a board meeting and discuss whether Miss Winters should continue in her role as president. Her behavior today, combined with the documented harassment in these emails, raises serious questions about her judgment. Court is adjourned." Outside the courthouse, James was elated. "That went even better than I expected. Judge Martinez doesn't mess around. What happens now?" I asked, still processing everything. "You go back to your deployment. The injunction protects you. The HOA can't touch you or your property. In 60 days, we'll come back for the main lawsuit hearing. Based on what happened today, I think we have an excellent chance of winning damages for harassment and emotional distress, plus all attorneys' fees. Will Deborah be removed as president? That's up to the board, but after today's display, I'd be shocked if they keep her. She just became a massive liability." Marcus had been waiting outside the courtroom and joined us as we walked to the parking lot. "Man, I wish I'd been inside to see that. She really got kicked out and fined $500, I confirmed. "It was intense." We went to lunch at a local diner, and I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The legal threat was neutralized, at least temporarily. But I knew this wasn't completely over. That evening, I went back to my house to pack some things and prepare for my return flight to South Korea in 2 days. Marcus had to work the next day but promised to check on the house regularly. As I was loading my car, I noticed Deborah standing in her front yard, talking on her phone and glaring in my direction. I ignored her and went inside, but 20 minutes later, my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and saw Deborah standing on my porch. Every instinct told me not to answer, but I also wanted to record whatever she was about to say. I pulled out my phone, set it to record audio, and opened the door. "Miss Winters, I don't think we should be talking directly. I have an attorney." "I know you do," she said, her voice icy. "I wanted to tell you personally that you haven't won anything. That judge was biased and clearly anti-HOA. I'm going to appeal her decision, and I'm going to make sure you follow the same rules as everyone else." "The rules don't override federal law, Miss Winters. I'm deployed. I'm protected by the Servicemembers Civil Relief Act. That law is un-American. It gives soldiers special rights that nobody else gets." I felt my anger rising but kept my voice level. "That law exists because soldiers serve their country and shouldn't have to worry about their homes being attacked by their own neighbors while they're overseas defending those neighbors' freedom. Don't you dare play the patriot card with me. My father was in the military and he never asked for special treatment. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking to not be fined and harassed while I'm literally in South Korea defending this country. There's a difference. Your lawn is a disgrace. Your mailbox looks terrible. You're bringing down property values. No, I'm not. You're manufacturing violations because you enjoy the power trip. And today in court you showed everyone exactly who you are." Deborah's face contorted with rage. "You think you're so smart, don't you? You and your fancy attorney. But I know things about you, Aaron Anderson. I know you had the police called on you 2 years ago for a domestic dispute." I was stunned. "What are you talking about? That never happened." "Oh, it happened. I have documentation. Maybe I'll share it with the whole neighborhood, let them know what kind of person really lives on Maple Street." "You're lying. That never happened because I've never had a domestic dispute. I'm not even married." "Well, maybe I'm misremembering, but there's something in your past, I'm sure of it. And I'll find it." This was veering into dangerous territory. "Miss Winters, you need to leave my property now. This conversation is over. You can't tell me what to do on public property. You're on my porch. That's private property. Leave now or I'm calling the police." She stood there for another moment, her eyes blazing, then turned and walked away. I closed the door and immediately sent the audio recording to James Rodriguez with a message explaining what had just happened. He called me 5 minutes later. "Aaron, this is gold. She just threatened to fabricate information about you and spread it to your neighbors. That's defamation and harassment. This actually strengthens our case significantly. Should I file a police report? Not yet. She didn't make any explicit threats of violence, but document everything. If she contacts you again, don't engage. Record it if possible and send it to me immediately." I spent a restless night at my house, half expecting Deborah to do something crazy. The next morning, I woke to dozens of messages on my phone. My neighbors had all received an email from Deborah overnight, sent from the HOA's official email address. The email was titled "Important Community Update" and was a masterpiece of manipulation and half-truths. Deborah claimed that certain residents were trying to undermine the HOA's authority, and that this would lead to declining property values and a deterioration of neighborhood standards. She didn't mention my name specifically, but included my address in a list of properties currently under violation review. She also claimed that the recent court hearing had been a minor procedural matter, and that the HOA's enforcement actions would continue. She stated that she had the full support of the board and that residents should report any violations they observed. Tom Harrison called me immediately. "Aaron, this woman has lost her mind. I'm calling an emergency board meeting. Several of us homeowners have that right under the HOA bylaws if we can get 20% of residents to sign a petition. She needs to be removed. Tom, I appreciate that, but I don't want to cause more problems in the neighborhood. You're not causing problems. She is. This email is defamatory and probably illegal. My son wants to write a story about this for the paper, by the way. Are you willing to talk to him? I thought about it. Part of me wanted to keep this private, but Deborah clearly wasn't going to stop. Maybe public accountability was exactly what she needed. Okay, have him call me. Tom's son, Michael Harrison, called an hour later. He was a seasoned investigative reporter who'd won awards for his work exposing corruption in local government. We talked for over an hour, and I sent him copies of all the emails, the court documents, and the audio recording from Deborah's visit to my house. This is a great story, Aaron. It hits on several important issues: HOA overreach, military service members' rights, and what happens when someone with a personality disorder gets a tiny bit of power. I'm going to reach out to Deborah and the other board members for comment. The story should run in about a week. Will it mention my name? Yes, but in a positive context. You're the victim here, and you were serving your country when this happened. The focus will be on Deborah's behavior and the HOA's violations of federal law. I flew back to South Korea the next day, feeling cautiously optimistic. The injunction protected me, and now there was momentum building to remove Deborah from her position. But I underestimated her determination to make my life miserable. 2 weeks later, Michael Harrison's story ran on the front page of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's local section. The headline read, "Deployed soldier faces HOA harassment despite federal protections." The story was detailed and fair, presenting all the facts and including responses from various parties. Deborah had declined to comment, but her attorney Brian Fletcher had provided a brief statement saying the HOA believed it had acted appropriately, and that the matter was under review. The other board members had distanced themselves from Deborah, with Richard Caldwell stating that he hadn't been aware of the extent of the situation, and that the board would be reevaluating our procedures and leadership. The story went viral locally. It was picked up by several military advocacy websites and shared thousands of times on social media. Suddenly, Meadowbrook Hills HOA was infamous, and Deborah Winters was the face of HOA tyranny. The backlash was swift. Within 3 days, Tom Harrison had collected signatures from 40% of the neighborhood residents calling for an emergency meeting to vote on removing Deborah as president. The meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks later. I participated via video call from South Korea. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, and over 100 residents attended, far more than the usual board meetings. Marcus attended in person to represent me. Tom Harrison chaired the meeting as the most senior former board member present. He laid out the case against Deborah systematically. The violation of federal law, the contempt of court citation, the harassing emails, the threatening visit to my house, and the defamatory community email. Deborah defended herself passionately, claiming she was being persecuted for doing her job. I have worked tirelessly to maintain property values in this community. I have enforced our bylaws fairly and consistently. This witch hunt is the result of one person who thinks he's above the rules and has manipulated all of you with his military status. The room erupted. Several residents shouted over each other, some supporting Deborah but most condemning her. Tom had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. "Miss Winters, nobody is above the rules, but federal law supersedes HOA bylaws. You were informed of this repeatedly by both Mr. Anderson and his attorney. You chose to ignore the law and continue harassment. That's not doing your job. That's abuse of power. The vote wasn't close. 87 residents voted to remove Deborah as president, 23 voted to keep her, and 12 abstained. She was also voted off the board entirely by a similar margin. Deborah's reaction was explosive. She stood up, screaming that the vote was illegitimate and that she would sue the HOA and every resident who voted against her. She had to be escorted out by security when she refused to leave the clubhouse. Richard Caldwell was elected as the new president that same night. His first act was to send me a formal letter of apology on behalf of the HOA, stating that all violation notices were withdrawn, all fines were voided, and that the association would not take any action regarding my property while I remained deployed. I thought that would finally be the end of it. I was wrong again. 3 weeks later, I received a notification that Deborah Winters had filed a personal lawsuit against me for defamation, claiming that my statements to the media and in court had damaged her reputation and caused her emotional distress. She was seeking $50,000 in damages. James Rodriguez was incredulous when I forwarded him the lawsuit. "This is the most frivolous thing I've ever seen. Everything you said was true and documented. Truth is an absolute defense against defamation. She's going to lose this badly, and she might face sanctions for filing a frivolous lawsuit. Why would she do this if she's going to lose? Because she's vindictive and can't let go. Some people can't handle losing, especially people who are used to having power. She probably thinks she can bully you into settling." The lawsuit required me to respond within 30 days. James filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that the lawsuit was frivolous and requesting sanctions against Deborah. He also filed a countersuit for continued harassment and malicious prosecution. The legal system moved slowly, but Judge Martinez was still handling the case, and she was clearly out of patience with Deborah. At the hearing to consider the motion to dismiss, which I attended via video link from South Korea, Judge Martinez didn't mince words. "Miss Winters, I have reviewed your complaint and it is without merit." Everything Mr. Anderson stated publicly was either already part of the public court record or was his own factual experience. "You have not identified a single false statement. I'm granting Mr. Rodriguez's motion to dismiss with prejudice, meaning you cannot refile this claim. Furthermore, I'm imposing sanctions of $5,000 against you personally for filing a frivolous lawsuit. These sanctions will be paid to Mr. Anderson's attorney." Deborah, representing herself this time after Brian Fletcher had apparently dropped her as a client, tried to argue. "Your Honor, he destroyed my reputation. I lost my position in the HOA because of his lies. Miss Winters, you lost your position because of your own actions. You violated federal law, ignored a court order, harassed a deployed service member, and showed contempt for this court. Mr. Anderson simply told the truth about your behavior. That is not defamation. Case dismissed." But Deborah still wasn't done. Over the next 2 months, as I continued my deployment in South Korea, she engaged in a campaign of petty harassment that bordered on stalking. She would drive by my house multiple times a day, taking photos. She posted in neighborhood Facebook groups, making thinly veiled references to certain residents who use their military status to avoid responsibility. She even filed complaints with the county about alleged code violations at my property. County inspectors came out 3 times and found nothing wrong, noting in their reports that the property was well maintained and in full compliance with all county codes. Each incident was documented and added to our ongoing lawsuit. James kept building the case, and finally, 4 months into my deployment, we had our day in court for the main harassment lawsuit. I was granted leave to return home for the hearing, which was scheduled to last 2 days. This time, the courtroom was more crowded, with several of my neighbors attending to support me, along with a few reporters including Michael Harrison. James presented our case methodically. He showed the timeline of harassment, the repeated violations of the SCRA and Georgia law, the contempt of court citation, the frivolous defamation lawsuit, and the ongoing stalking behavior. He presented testimony from neighbors who described Deborah's erratic and vindictive behavior. Tom Harrison testified about how she tried to turn the neighborhood against me. The county code inspectors testified about the frivolous complaints. The evidence was overwhelming. Deborah represented herself again and did herself no favors. She was combative, emotional, and repeatedly tried to argue that she'd been doing her job and that I was trying to destroy her for it. Judge Martinez listened patiently, but I could see her frustration growing. When it was time for closing arguments, James was brief and pointed. "Your Honor, this case is about a pattern of harassment and abuse of power that continued even after this court explicitly ordered it to stop. Miss Winters has shown no remorse, no understanding that she violated federal law, and no willingness to leave Mr. Anderson alone. He has suffered significant emotional distress, has incurred substantial legal fees defending himself, and has been unable to focus on his military duties because of this ongoing harassment. We ask the court to award damages for emotional distress, all attorneys' fees, and a permanent restraining order preventing Miss Winters from contacting Mr. Anderson or coming within 100 yards of his property." Deborah's closing argument was rambling and increasingly desperate. She claimed she was the real victim, that the military gave people like me too much power, and that the court system was biased against HOA volunteers who were just trying to help their communities. Judge Martinez took less than an hour to deliberate. When she returned, her expression was stern. "I have reviewed all the evidence and testimony in this case, and I find in favor of Mr. Anderson on all counts. Miss Winters, your behavior has been reprehensible. You were informed repeatedly of federal law protecting deployed service members. You chose to ignore that law. When this court issued an injunction, you found ways to continue your harassment. You filed a frivolous lawsuit. You engaged in stalking behavior. Your actions are not those of a dedicated community volunteer. They are the actions of someone who cannot accept that their power has limits. I am awarding Mr. Anderson $30,000 in damages for emotional distress and harassment. I am awarding him full attorney's fees, which according to the billing submitted total $18,000. I am issuing a permanent restraining order prohibiting you from contacting Mr. Anderson directly or indirectly, from coming within 100 yards of his property, and from posting about him on social media or in any public forum. Violation of this restraining order will result in your arrest. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the DeKalb County District Attorney's Office for potential criminal charges. Your pattern of behavior, particularly the stalking and harassment after my previous orders, may constitute criminal harassment under Georgia law. That will be for the DA to decide." Deborah's face went white. "You're having me arrested for trying to maintain community standards." "No, Miss Winters. I'm referring your case to the DA for potential charges because you repeatedly violated court orders and engaged in criminal harassment." There's a difference, though you seem unable to grasp it. This hearing is concluded. The DA's office moved quickly. Within 2 weeks, they filed criminal charges against Deborah for criminal harassment and stalking. Georgia law defined criminal harassment as making contact with another person without legitimate purpose after being asked to stop, when such contact causes substantial emotional distress. The stalking charge related to her pattern of driving by my house and taking photos. I was back in South Korea when the criminal case went to trial 2 months later, but James kept me updated throughout. Marcus attended the trial to represent our family. The prosecutor laid out the case effectively, showing the pattern of behavior the court orders Deborah had violated and the impact on me. They presented psychological testimony about the stress military members faced during deployment and how Deborah's harassment had exacerbated that stress. Deborah's public defender tried to argue that she had legitimate concerns about property values and hadn't understood that her behavior was criminal. But the evidence was too strong, and Deborah's own social media posts, which investigators had uncovered, showed she'd been obsessed with teaching that soldier a lesson. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and found Deborah guilty on both counts. She was sentenced to 2 years of probation, 100 hours of community service, mandatory anger management counseling, and ordered to pay restitution covering my legal fees that weren't covered by the civil judgment. The judge in the criminal case also made a point of saying, "Miss Winters, you could have avoided all of this by simply following federal law and leaving Mr. Anderson alone while he served his country. Instead, you chose to harass him relentlessly. I hope you use your probation period to reflect on your behavior and develop some understanding of why it was wrong. I completed my deployment in South Korea and returned home 6 months after this all began. My house was in good condition thanks to Marcus's regular maintenance. The new HOA board under Richard Caldwell's leadership was reasonable and professional. They'd even sent me care packages during my deployment and had organized a welcome home gathering when I returned. Deborah Winters moved out of Meadowbrook Hills 2 months after her criminal conviction. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd sold her house at a loss and moved to another state. Several neighbors told me she'd become increasingly isolated after losing her HOA position, with most residents avoiding her. I felt a strange mix of emotions about the whole situation. Part of me felt vindicated that the legal system had worked and that justice had been served. But I also felt exhausted from the fight and sad that it had escalated so far. All of this could have been avoided if Deborah had just followed the law and treated me with basic human decency. Tom Harrison stopped by a few days after I got home, bringing a 6-pack of beer and some burgers to grill. We sat on my back deck as the sun set, enjoying the warm Georgia evening. "You know, Aaron, what happened with Deborah was ugly, but something good came out of it," Tom said, taking a sip of his beer. "What's that?" "The whole neighborhood learned about service members' rights. Richard has made it HOA policy that any deployed military member automatically gets a grace period on all non-essential maintenance, and the HOA will even arrange for basic lawn care if needed. They're calling it the Anderson policy." I felt a lump in my throat. They're naming it after me. Damn right they are. You stood up for yourself and for every other military member who might face this situation. That matters. The civil judgment and criminal restitution payments came in slowly over the following months. Deborah made minimum payments as ordered by the court, and I used the money to pay off some debt and make improvements to my house. I also donated a portion to a military legal aid charity that helps service members deal with legal issues during deployment. A year later, I was preparing for another deployment, this time to Germany. The new HOA board couldn't have been more supportive. Richard Caldwell personally came by to let me know they had my back and that I shouldn't worry about anything while I was gone. "Just serve your country and come home safe," Richard said, shaking my hand. "We'll take care of the home front." Marcus had gotten married during that year and had moved closer to my neighborhood. He and his wife Jennifer offered to check on my house weekly, and several neighbors volunteered to help with any maintenance issues. As I packed for deployment, I reflected on how much had changed in 1 year. I'd gone from being harassed and threatened by my own HOA to being supported and valued by my community. I'd learned a lot about standing up for myself, about the importance of knowing your rights, and about how one person's abuse of power could be stopped by the legal system when people were willing to fight. I also thought about Deborah sometimes, wondering if she'd learned anything from the experience or if she was out there somewhere, still convinced she'd been right all along. I hoped for her sake that she'd gotten the help she needed and had learned to let go of her need for control. My second deployment went smoothly, with no HOA drama whatsoever. I stayed in touch with Marcus and my neighbors through video calls and social media. My house was well maintained, and when I returned 6 months later, I came home to another welcome celebration organized by the HOA. Michael Harrison's article about my case had won a regional journalism award and had sparked a broader conversation about HOA reform in Georgia. State legislators had even introduced a bill to strengthen protections for deployed military members and impose penalties on HOAs that violated those protections. The bill was nicknamed Aaron's Law by its sponsors, though I tried to stay out of the political aspects of it. I eventually gave testimony before a state legislative committee about my experience. It was surreal sitting in the Georgia state capitol, telling my story to lawmakers who were genuinely interested in making changes. The bill passed with bipartisan support and was signed into law by the governor. The law required HOAs to suspend all enforcement actions against deployed military members automatically upon notification of deployment, provided education materials about service members' rights to all HOAs, and created significant penalties for violations. It also required HOAs to designate a liaison for military families and to provide reasonable accommodations for deployed members. I received letters and emails from other military members who'd faced similar situations, thanking me for standing up and making it easier for them. That meant more to me than any judgment or award. Knowing that my experience had helped others made the whole ordeal feel worthwhile. 3 years after the initial incident, I was promoted to staff sergeant and was stationed at Fort Moore in Georgia, which meant I could continue living in my house in Meadowbrook Hills. The neighborhood had become home in a way I never expected. The trauma of the HOA harassment had been transformed into something positive. A stronger community, better protections for military members, and genuine friendships with my neighbors. I ran into Brian Fletcher, Deborah's former attorney, at a local coffee shop one morning. He recognized me and, after a moment of hesitation, came over to my table. "Mr. Anderson, I want to apologize," he said. "I was young and stupid, and I let Deborah push me into taking positions that were legally indefensible. I should have told her no from the beginning. What she put you through was wrong, and I'm sorry I was part of it." I appreciated his honesty. "I understand. She was your client and you were trying to do your job. Still, I should have known better. I've learned a lot since then about HOA law and service members' rights. I actually focus on representing military members against HOAs now. Your case changed my career direction." We talked for a while longer, and I left feeling like closure had come full circle. Even the people who'd been on the wrong side had learned and grown from the experience. As I drove home that day, passing through the tree-lined streets of Meadowbrook Hills, I thought about how different things were now compared to that day 3 years ago, when I'd received Deborah's first threatening email halfway around the world. The same neighborhood that had once felt hostile now felt welcoming. The HOA that had been a source of stress was now a source of support. My lawn was neatly trimmed. My mailbox had been repainted in a neighborhood volunteer day, and my flower beds were full of blooming plants that Jennifer had helped me select. Everything Deborah had claimed was wrong with my property had been addressed, not through fines and threats, but through community support and cooperation. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment, just taking it all in. Home ownership came with responsibilities, and HOAs could serve a legitimate purpose in maintaining community standards. But there had to be balance, compassion, and respect for the law. What I'd learned through this ordeal was that standing up for yourself mattered, that the legal system could work when you had good representation, and that most people, when given the choice between supporting a power-hungry tyrant or supporting someone serving their country, would make the right choice. I never heard from Deborah Winters again. Her probation ended eventually, and I hoped she'd moved on with her life and learned from her mistakes. I held no ill will toward her anymore. The anger and frustration had faded, replaced by gratitude for the positive changes that had come from a negative situation. That evening, Marcus and Jennifer came over for dinner. We grilled steaks on my back deck and talked about his upcoming work promotion and their plans to start a family. Tom and his wife stopped by later with dessert, and we all sat outside enjoying the pleasant evening. "You know, Aaron, you should write a book about all this," Tom suggested. "HOA horror stories, a military member's battle against bureaucratic tyranny." Everyone laughed, but Marcus nodded. "He's not wrong. Your story has everything: conflict, legal drama, a clear villain, and a satisfying ending." "I think I've had enough attention from this situation," I said. "I'm happy just living my life and hoping it helps other people avoid the same problems." "Fair enough," Tom said. "But if you ever change your mind, you've got a hell of a story to tell." As my friends and family sat around talking and laughing on my deck, I realized that this was what home really meant. It wasn't just the house or the property or meeting HOA standards. It was the people, the community, the relationships that made a place worth fighting for. I joined the military to serve my country and protect American freedoms. I never imagined I'd have to fight a legal battle on the home front just to maintain basic rights while deployed. But that experience had taught me that service and sacrifice came in many forms, and that standing up against injustice, even in seemingly small matters like HOA disputes, was part of defending the principles America stood for. The Service Members Civil Relief Act existed for a reason, and thanks to what had happened with Deborah Winters, more people now understood why those protections were necessary. Georgia's enhanced law would help future military members avoid the harassment I'd faced. And Meadowbrook Hills HOA had become a model for how community associations should treat deployed service members. Looking back, I wouldn't say I was grateful for what Deborah had put me through. The stress, the legal fees, the distraction during deployment, all of it had been genuinely difficult. But I was grateful for how I'd responded, for the people who'd supported me, and for the positive changes that had resulted. As the evening wound down and my guests headed home, I stood on my front porch for a moment, looking at my house in the soft glow of the porch light. This was my home, bought with my own money, maintained with reasonable care, and protected by laws that recognized the sacrifices military members make. No HOA president, no matter how power-hungry or unreasonable, could take that away from me. I'd stood my ground, fought the legal battle and won not just for myself, but for others who might face similar situations. That was something worth being proud of. I went inside, locked the door, and settled in for a peaceful evening at home. Tomorrow I'd head to base for training exercises. Next month I might deploy again. But tonight I was home, surrounded by a supportive community with all the drama of the HOA battle firmly in the past. The house was quiet and comfortable, exactly as it should be. My military career would continue, taking me to various places around the world, but this house in Meadowbrook Hills would always be here waiting for me. And thanks to the legal protections I'd fought to enforce, and the new policies that had been implemented, no future deployment would bring the same kind of harassment I'd endured. As I prepared for bed, my phone buzzed with a message from Richard Caldwell, the HOA president. It was a simple note letting me know that the annual HOA meeting was coming up, and asking if I'd be willing to share my story with new residents as part of their orientation on military family support. I smiled and typed back a response saying I'd be happy to help. Turning a negative experience into education and support for others felt like the right way to honor everything I'd been through. That night, I slept soundly in my own bed, in my own home, in a neighborhood that had learned important lessons about respecting service members and following the law. The battle was over, justice had been served, and life had moved forward in the best possible way. The story of my HOA nightmare had become a cautionary tale, a teaching tool, and ultimately, a victory for common sense and the rule of law. Deborah Winters had demanded I maintain my property during deployment, declaring that the law didn't apply. But the law had spoken clearly. They couldn't do what they'd tried to do, and there were consequences for ignoring federal protections. It was a lesson I hoped other HOA board members would learn without having to go through the same legal battles. Military members serving overseas deserved support from their communities, not harassment. That was the American way, and thanks to one woman's overreach and subsequent accountability, that principle had been reinforced in law, in policy, and in the hearts of one Georgia neighborhood.